Governments always tell us that they are working for our financial salvation. Everywhere you look, you hear words like stability, growth, and opportunity. But when we look honestly at history, we can see a much stranger truth. Governments have always played clever financial games to keep power and money in their own hands, while leaving citizens like us without wealth. And the interesting part? These tricks are not new at all. Since ancient times, they've been rebranded and resold under new names. But the goal has always been the same: keep the money with the rich and keep the lower classes dependent on their system. Let's start with the oldest and most effective mind game: inflation. When a government spends the money it collects from citizens, it has two options. It can either impose visible taxes, which politicians rarely have the courage to do, or it can secretly reduce the value of money, making the cash in our pockets worth less. The Romans were masters of this trick. In the 3rd century AD, emperors who needed funds for war began to reduce the silver content in the denarius coin. What was once pure silver eventually turned into copper, coated with a thin layer of silver. The government pretended nothing had happened, but everyone who used that money suffered. Prices rose, savers revolted, wages vanished. It was an invisible tax taken without the people's consent, and it's the same method central banks use today. In the Middle Ages, a different trick emerged: forced loans. Monarchs in England and France would take money from wealthy merchants and tradesmen by force. Saying no meant punishment or confiscation of property. They sometimes promised to repay the money, but it was either repaid much later, with inflated currency, or not at all. Governments maintained their wealth, while merchants watched their hard-earned fortunes evaporate. The trick was to disguise the act as patriotism. They appealed to people's emotions. In the 17th century, the financial system itself became the trick. When the Bank of England was founded in 1694, it wasn't created for the people. The state needed money for weapons and soldiers. Wealthy investors bought government bonds, and the state promised to pay them interest, using tax revenues. Sounds normal, right? But who paid those taxes? The public, through levies on salt, beer, and cloth. The rich lent money to the state and earned guaranteed interest, while the poor paid higher taxes to cover it. This was presented as national financing, but it was actually a system that funneled money from the bottom to the top, and it still works that way today. The safest investment is lending to the government, and the interest is guaranteed by the taxpayers. Even now, the mind games are everywhere. Think about deficit spending. Governments take on massive debts, selling them to banks and foreign powers. Politicians claim it's for roads, bridges, jobs, or social welfare, but much of it ends up as subsidies to defense companies and big corporations. When the debt needs to be repaid, cuts never come from the top. Taxes are raised or new money is printed, creating inflation. The trick is that the debt is framed as being for the people, while the people bear the cost and the lenders reap the profit. Then there are the so-called bank bailouts. During the 2008 crisis, banks made reckless investments and collapsed. Who paid the price? Ordinary citizens through massive government support. And who profited? The same banks that emerged even bigger after the crisis. The trick was simple: privatize the profits, socialize the losses. The public was told it was necessary to save the system. Even the way governments manage retirement funds is a scam. People pay into the system their entire lives, believing they'll get pensions in old age. But governments don't save that money. They spend it immediately and replace it with an IOU, a promise that future generations will pay the bill. This is an officially sanctioned Ponzi scheme. When does it collapse? When the aging population grows too large for the system to sustain. Then governments do something different: reduce pensions, raise the retirement age, or devalue money through inflation. Look closely at the system. At every step, the deception relies on perception management. Inflation is called growth. Forced loans are labeled duty. State debt is branded as investment. Bank bailouts are called stability. Salary cuts become adjustments. The language they use hides the truth: the transfer of wealth from poor to rich. History shows that this deception works because most people don't look back, don't understand financial systems, and realize the trap only when it's too late. In recent times, the tricks have evolved. Think of quantitative easing before the 2008 crisis. Central banks created trillions of dollars out of thin air, buying bonds and inflating markets. Leaders claimed it stopped the downturn. It did. If you were part of the financial system, housing, land, and stock prices soared. But who owns most of those assets? The rich. For ordinary people without investments, it did nothing but raise the cost of living and widen inequality. The trick was simple. Money printing saved the top of the pyramid while making life harder for everyone else. A new modern trick is the hidden tax. Instead of raising income taxes, governments use sales taxes, fuel taxes, and most of all, Inflation to collect money secretly. When prices rise faster than wages, the difference acts as a hidden tax on your savings and purchasing power. Governments love inflation because it reduces the real value of their debts while melting away our money. Your salary may look higher on paper, but in real value, you're poor. This isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system. Inflation isn't an accident, it's a deliberate tool used by governments to shift their costs onto the public. Another layer of deception is the capture of public institutions by large corporations. Regulations are supposed to protect us, banking laws, safety standards. But history shows that powerful companies often control the very agencies meant to regulate them. In the 19th century, it was railroads. In the 20th, oil companies. Today, it's tech and finance giants. Governments use regulation to look responsible, but behind the scenes, monopolies craft loopholes that funnel profits their way. The public thinks they're being protected. Insiders quietly profit. Financing war is another recycled trick. During World Wars I and II, governments sold bonds, convincing citizens that buying them was a patriotic duty. People wanted to support their countries. But those bonds were backed by future tax revenues, guaranteed risk-free profits for the wealthy. Nothing has changed. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were also funded by debt. Defense contractors and lenders got richer. The public paid the bill. The trick? Wars are always presented as temporary emergencies, yet their financial damage lasts for generations. Governments also use complexity as a financial trick. Thousands of pages of tax laws, confusing financial instruments, and budgets full of hidden figures all make it impossible for the average person to follow the money. Complexity is camouflage. When you can't trace the money, you can't resist the system. In ancient Rome, the collapse of currency was visible. Today, it's buried under acronyms and jargon, so that wealth transfers happen unnoticed. So why should we care? Because these tricks are still happening and getting worse. Inflation eats away your savings. Public debt grows every year. Failing banks are still bailed out. Central banks manipulate the money supply at will, while governments make us pay in invisible ways that most people never notice. The result? The rich grow more powerful, while the poor are forced to work harder just to survive. What history shows us isn't just that these tricks exist, but that they repeat. When Rome debased its coins, the people suffered. When kings demanded loans, merchants lost their fortunes. When modern governments print money and take on debt, we bear the burden again. The eras change, but the pattern remains. And here's the harsh truth. Most people never understand the trick. They see inflation as natural, taxes as necessary, and bank bailouts as benevolent. They believe the government's words instead of studying economic history. That ignorance is the greatest trick of all. When people forget history, they don't recognize its repetition. That's why governments and the wealthy prefer a financially illiterate public. Understanding finance is a form of defense. Economic history is a weapon. If you know the tricks, you can protect yourself. So what should we do? First, look behind the curtain. When the government announces support, ask who benefits first. When inflation rises, remember it's no accident. It's intentional. When new laws appear, ask who they serve. Second, build wealth without falling into their traps. Understand that money itself is losing value. Acquire assets that hold real worth. Third, remember, the system doesn't work for you. Systems exist to sustain themselves, not to protect you. History doesn't repeat word for word, but if you ignore it, it crushes you just the same. The financial tricks that left Romans broke are the same ones that impoverish you today, only disguised with new language. The only difference is whether you act in time. If this gave you a new perspective, hit the subscribe button. The answers are hidden in history, and I'll show you where to find them.